But it works because a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you is kind of extending on an earlier version of Jones' model, back when there was kind of binomial sampling of it. And so this was really inspired by this. This is a lot of my thesis research that I'm presenting, and it's the first time I'm presenting it to a holobiont audience. So first trial by fire of the concept. So here we go. So I call this title, is the holobiont a unit of selection, a mathematical framework. This is the clickbaity title. The real title is let's see, a tiny step towards a mathematical theory of holobiont evolution and multi-level selection through a model with some major technical flaws, but it's still pretty useful, I think. And so what attracted me to this field is not only like these beautiful concepts, but also this big kind of controversy, and I think Seth's going to talk about it tomorrow more. But I was told, like, aim for where the water's choppy. That's where there's good science to be done. So I'm like, okay, let's go over here and start studying this. And it's this question, and is the holobiont a unit of selection? And often people are thinking as unit of selection in some form of something similar to the Wanton's, like conditions, this abstract thing where you have phenotypic variation and differential fitness and heritability of fitness, or some sort of covariance thing going on there. And a lot of this depends on, right, the individual being a discrete, well-defined entity. And of course, at least when I first came here, yeah.
Am I allowed to chat?
Yeah, of course.
Lewington actually, in his 1970 paper on units of selection, leaves room for selection at community and even ecosystem levels, because the way he defined those three parameters are so general that they could exist even outside of individuals. And I actually think that if you look back, the whole Wyand framework would have been really consistent with Lewington's three criteria, because he was kind of there already from an ecosystem or community context.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, he actually has paragraphs that are labeled at the ecosystem level or community level.
Yeah. One is always
Worth
clearer
reading.
than I am. But yeah, there's kind of like there's sometimes this tension, I guess, of like, these holobionts are kind of fuzzy, you're leaking, there's horizontal transfer, and then like maybe a more naive understanding of these conditions is like you have to be this discrete, concrete entity. And so that's kind of like where I came in. It's like, there's some controversy here, and I thought, I'm like, a lot of the problem is that there is this thinness we were discussing of mathematical models, and I think the math can really clarify the thinking, the concepts behind what we're doing. So of course I started like trying to make a mathematical model, and I am going about this in maybe a little less traditional of an approach than most modelers would, where I am stealing from the pure mathematicians, specifically Grothendieck, this great algebraic geometer, and he would, instead of directly attacking the problem, he would spend a lot of time theory crafting it until the problem became trivial. So his mathematics, it would look like nothing's happening for a long time, and then suddenly, boom, the problem solved, and you're like, wait, what happened? Well, he was spending a lot of time painting a landscape in which the answer becomes obvious, and this is called the rising sea strategy. So we are going to kind of approach it this way, but we are also going to approach it kind of from the bottom up, starting from minimal models to getting an intuition. So here's a roadmap. We're going to actually ignore this left-hand side, because when I started this, I made two different minimal models of holobiont evolution, and one turns out to be kind of useless. It doesn't help at all with holobiont stuff. You get great results about bacterial aging and evolution of runs of the litter from it, but side story, we are on this right side where, spoiler alert, where we start with a holobiont kind of toy model. We were talking about like what a minimal model might look like. This is one proposal for a minimal model. Then we're going to flesh it out a little before we get to this much more general model that I call the symbolic equivalent model, which works with arbitrary number of species for arbitrarily large holobionts. And then we are going to show that this model is actually equivalent to a special case of the replicator mutator equations, tying this theory to a more traditional framework. This will give us something you might call a mathematical theory of holobiont evolution, and then we can use this theory to much more easily answer the question for a given system, is the holobiont a unit of selection? And a lot of this is going to rely on making a very kind of painful mathematical translation, very formal of all of like exactly what you mean by holobiont and unit of selection. And this in the end will correspond to this sort of intuition of you are looking from at the same dynamical system from multiple different perspectives and measuring natural selection from each perspective and how much that perspective explains in terms of natural selection. So that's kind of the main outline of where we're going. I want to start with one minimal toy model. And this model is a 2-host 2 microbe model. Very simple. You start with 2 populations and there's 2 species each. It's the smallest you can get where you can measure the frequency change in 2 populations. And everything I'm doing, everything is going to be frequency dependent here. And what happens is they randomly mix together in the population and you randomly get colonized by one microbe, and I'm thinking like, maybe it's a very dense microbes all around. You definitely get colonized, it's inevitable, and there's some priority effects maybe where the first one kind of takes over and excludes the others, but you get colonized by one, and anybody without a partner, they die, they disappear, and you're left with these holobionts. And if we look at one holobiont and say, what happens to it? What goes on with it? Well, maybe there's some arbitrary, like ecological dynamics, things are happening, but in the end, on average, they're going to spit out they're going to make some number of new hosts and some number of new microbes. And this, how much you make is going to just be, the individual's fitness is going to be a function of the holobiont they are in. So very mechanism agnostic. I'm trying to sketch out like the abstract framework of the mathematics. So mechanism agnostic, you just in the end spit out some number of individuals. And you go play this game for every holobiont in your population. You look at them all, you're like, each individual's fitness is some function of the holobiont they are in. And then the holobionts die. This is non-overlapping generations, and boom, you are left with the populations at the next generation. So hopefully that minimal model makes sense, pretty basic. And
so there's no heritability of the microbiomes.
yeah, so everything I'm doing, this is an important point, is like 100% horizontal transmission, like as horizontal as you can get. And this is one of the major flaws of the model, is like we are just dragged our slider all the way to the end of like 100% horizontal, like it gets unreasonably horizontal, but it's also mathematically easier to do that than something mixed.
Well, that's not unreasonable here.
Is it not?
Not in the ocean.
Nice, nice. That makes me feel better. That makes me feel better. So, okay, so 2 steps again. Randomly recombine to form every possible holobiont, and then individuals reproduce as a function, fitness as a function of the holobiont they are in. And just to briefly, me and my students have been like systematically going through the possible dynamics, and there's only like 3 really dynamics you see that are non-degenerate trivial cases, which is you have one basin of attraction, there's one holobiont that always does the best, takes over, and then you have 2 basins of attraction where initial conditions matter, and finally, most interestingly, you get heteroclinic cycling, these cyclic dynamics, and this is cool because even in this minimal model you can get these interesting cycles where it happens when there is conflict between the host and microbiome levels in some way. Like if you are host big A with microbe little a, well, host big A tends to favor little b microbes, so they invade, and then you're A, little b, and then that favors big B host, so they invade, and you get this cycling where nobody's happy with the status quo. And an amazing thing is that this happens even if microbes have very small effect on host fitness. So that's kind of cool, and it's somewhat common. I think if you just throw out random parameters, it happens 1/8 of the time. I forgot the exact number, but it happens. It's not a smallest part of parameter space that this happens. Okay, so I'm gonna skip this for time, but it's an advertisement to talk to me offline about this, that if you take this model and say, just add more potential species of host and microbes, you can get this model of a special case of the replicator equations, and you can show that this is equivalent to certain problems in network topology. Or you could start asking what happens if we just add more species to this model, and looking at when we have non-equilibrium dynamics, and as you add more species, these are all just random parameter runs.
Sorry, the number of hosts must be equal to the number of microbiomes?
No, I was just lazy when I coded this. I think what matters is the smallest number here, I think is what's going to matter, but I'm not sure. I haven't actually tried it with the different numbers, but in general, they don't need to be equal.
And then the replicator equation, essentially you would get so the dimension of the replicator equation would be equal to the sum of the host plus the microbiome species.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, you might be right. Not actually sure off the top of my head, but yeah, there's more work to be done on like the unequal numbers. But as you increase the number of species, we see that non-equilibrium dynamics become more and more common until eventually they become inevitable. And this is kind of cool. And you can ask, what's the probability of getting non-equilibrium dynamics? And as a first order approximation, you can show that this is actually equivalent to certain combinatorics problems in pure math about counting the number of Latin squares, like Sudoku puzzles, which is really weird. You've taken like this biology question and now it's about the number of possible Sudoku puzzles. And that's not just a curiosity, there's something important here because this is a hard problem, but it's not our problem anymore. We've taken our problem and now it's the mathematician's problem. That's nice. Okay, so that's the advertisement to talk to me about this stuff later, but I want to get into the symbolic pooling model, which is this more general theory of something that I'm trying to play much closer to reality, to really respect that. There are thousands of microspecies in you, and they can have their own complex ecological dynamics, and there can be even deeper nested structures with like bacteriophages and who knows what else doing crazy things. Yeah.
Do you have you looked at how many of those solutions for steady state are feasible or like actually like above zero the values of the species?
Like for these on the random.
Yeah, like I guess that's like super interesting to me, but I'm curious to know how many of those. Well, I guess if they're all approaching non-equilibrium, then that means answer my question.
But yeah, I guess like a lot of species die, go extinct, and then but as you have lots of species, there's a high probability that some subset of them are going to get entangled in this really interesting dance. And I don't really deeply understand the dynamics there because I haven't studied it a lot. So that's something interesting.
In the time model, do you fix the number of hosts and microbe individuals in every generation?
Or say that again?
So can the number of hosts increase over time?
Oh, so I think this is, I'm assuming
It's all frequency.
infinite, yeah, I'm assuming like infinite population sizes.
Okay, so it's all
frequency, all frequency.
I'm sorry if I may ask another question for the time model. So you said like you can reduce it to a combinatory problem. So does that mean that the specific parameter value does not matter, or it matters is the specific like the relative value of this?
Yeah, so this is my conjecture. I haven't proven it, but I believe it is the relative ranking of the parameters that matter and that determine what happens.
I see. And also, is the probability of non-equilibrium coexistence larger or smaller than the probability of some species go extinct? if just random parameter combination.
By some species coexisting,
Like,
I mean, like
is it,
stable.
is it possible that, for example, some microbiome would eventually go extinct?
Yeah, so definitely like in the toy model, like some like when you like add a bunch, some go extinct. Interestingly, in the toy model, I have never seen like a stable coexistence of species. It's always like this oscillating thing with like often like fast transitions. But I don't, part of the reason like I'm going through this fast is because I don't understand this part of the toy model well once you go beyond 2 species, 2 hosts and 2 microbe species.
It's quite interesting because in replicated equations, well, not in this context, it's very easy to get like a stable equilibrium, right?
Yeah, and I think the reason that it becomes hard is, I can find this slide, it's hidden someplace. If you look here, like if you write, when you have this like host microbe population structure, it ends up getting this blocked diagonal zeros in the fitness matrix, which end up causing a lot of oscillation, like inherently. And I think that is one of the reasons why you're getting that. But like, part of my thing is like advertisement, I don't really understand like replicator equations that deeply, so maybe some of you that you can help me there. But okay, yeah, so general theory. Now we're going to like blow up this model to work with as many species as you want, as many different types of populations as you want, and really try to play close to nature and reality. And this is going to be much different than our cast before. You can start having things like this here, Snorlax, and you can have like maybe getting colonized by 2 microbes with a diploid host, or you can, what I'm more envisioning is something far more complicated. Many microbes are colonizing you, things are within microbes, and there's deep multi-level stuff going on at the same time as this holobiont stuff. And just as something I noticed, just as an aside, I've noticed that it seems that many level models of evolution exist. I see a lot of like 2-level models of evolution, but I feel there's a thinness in like 3 or more multi-evolution models, and I think this is the thinness of holobiont models and the thinness of these deeper multi-evolution models are kind of 2 sides of the same thin coin. So just an aside, but how can we take this toy model then and generalize it to this much more complicated, much huger multi-level system? And this is where I'm going to introduce the symbolic pooling model. So you have your individual populations, as many as you want. Here's a host population, a microbe population, a bacteriophage population, as many species as you want in each. You can think of these as just symbols floating around. And you're going to throw them all into a well-mixed environmental pool. And you're going to, here's the 100% horizontal gene or horizontal transmission part. You're going to just mix them up and let them randomly recombine into new holobionts, which I'm representing as a string, because I forgot to mention this, but if you go back to that multi-level Snorlax, you can encode it as you can just take the complexity here, like all of this multi-level complexity, and encode it as a string, more or less, where order maybe gives you some positional information or some sort of information. And if you do that, and you just randomly recombine, you're kind of thinking that you are forming all possible words out of like this alphabet made out of the individual populations. They're pooling the symbols together. Oh, symbolic pooling. Here we go. And then each of these holobionts then reproduces and they undergo arbitrary ecological dynamics. Maybe there's some mutation. I don't care. I'm agnostic to the mechanisms of what's going on. Again, trying to get at the abstract structure. They ultimately, on average, each holobiont like spits out a certain number of these kind of hosts, these kind of microbes, so on. Okay, so this is the symbolic pooling model. Hopefully it's fairly intuitive what's going on. And if you're eagle-eyed, you might be like, hey, hold up, Taom, wait up. You misspelled holobiont. This is that's not how you spell what's an ensemble. What's an ensemble? And this is a concept I want to introduce because I've noticed talking to a lot of non-holobiont people, especially people that don't like holobionts, they will argue that holobionts are too fragile. They're like always changing and they're not well defined. And maybe like if these, it's fine in this situation in our toy model, but what if like the bacteria like move around and you're like just one bacteria dies? Are you a different holobiont? If you encode it as a string, like just one letter changes, are you a different holobiont? So to kind of illustrate, like I'm a holobiont right now. I want to get at like ensembles are the string. They are a much more fragile concept. I am a holobiont. I'm the holobiont Taom, and I'm pretty stable. And oh no, I flicked a couple hundred bacteria off me. They went flying into the abyss. Oh, my string, if you encode me as a string, my string is different, but I'm still fundamentally the same holobiont. Nothing fundamental has changed. But my string is different, so I am a constantly changing ensemble, but that's still the same holobiont. So this is very similar to a quasi-species concept. Yeah.
I was just going to say that the way you illustrate that's excellent, and I think the beauty of the holobiont concept is it does allow for real-time dynamics within the host. That is, we are changing and evolving in real time because our microbes are moving as well, and that complexity is part of the enchantment, and I think also our goals for understanding.
Yeah. I agree. Like it's part of the reason I started studying it. This is beautiful.
But also, this kind of goes back to what I was trying to propose is the holobiont as a unit of selection, or evolutionary unit, because it's not only one of the constituent species being removed or added, it's the selective pressure that sees a collection of traits. So depending on how the selective pressure, what the selective pressure is, there's an ensemble that's seen, right?
Yeah.
So there's a relative phenotype that defines ensemble as well.
Yeah. So I think this ensemble concept as kind of like thinking it's the holobiont as like almost a cloud of possible ensemble points that you're like moving around in can be very useful for just technical mathematical modeling because you can think in terms of changing strings. And okay, so another thing just to point out is that before I was saying I'm agnostic to the mechanisms. You're just reproducing by some arbitrary dynamics, and I'm actually was not quite agnostic. I was making one assumption that you reproduce more of yourself. This also now allows for mutation to occur, or maybe somebody else colonized you after this initial colonization, and like completely arbitrary dynamics. All that matters is that you got colonized at like the start of your life. Whatever complicated stuff happened, and then you spit out some number of individuals at the end. So being very flexible to allow like whatever your favorite ecological model there. So
is there going to be famous differences?
Or
Is there going to be famous differences here? Since now you allow like very flexible combinations. How do you
Yeah.
understand the famous here?
yeah, so fitness is going to be a function of what ensemble you're in, what string. So what we're going to end up doing is saying that like you can look at a big vector of these strings, and then you have a linear function going down to just the letters, and each string will contribute linearly to each letter. And, yeah.
Sorry, did you?
Oh no.
Is this different than populating a tensor in like a constrained way randomly? Is it different than that?
I think so, but I'm not sure because spoiler alert, which I told you about, I'm going to be going into some tensor product formalism, which I self-taught, so I'm a bit of a handicap. So hopefully you'd be able to give much more insight from this since you've worked with them a lot. So if this wasn't a modeling audience, at this point I'd be like, ha ha ha, confession, I tricked you. You were actually doing some gnarly mathematics all along. And I don't want to go into these equations because it's pretty much just describing the model. I said it's just a lot of notational formalism. What I want to go into is this tensor product that I'm kind of hanging a lot of the power of this framework on. And the tensor project is going to allow us to kind of bookkeep all possible ways that individuals can combine together, bookkeep all of the strings we can form out of the symbols we are using, and it's going to do this in a way that keeps track of the population frequencies of these ensembles. And this is very similar, just pretty much a generalization of what we were doing in the toy model. And tensor project, a nice thing about it is that it corresponds to multilinear maps. So we have this kind of like, you have this vector space of population frequency, you tensor down, and then you do this to this vector. You pretty much like explode yourself into a bigger vector space of these ensemble frequencies, and then you can make a linear, there's a unique linear map going down to a population, and this is kind of like this contribution step, and this corresponds to a multilinear map, which, as a reminder, is it's a function. If you hold all but one variable constant, it's linear in that variable. And by construction, it is, leave that slide, never mind, yeah.
So the strength is that F is easier to work with than whatever G happens. Okay.
I think it's more like there's two different perspectives you can work with, because the symbolic pooling model, as we are doing it right now, is really that this is representing the random recombination, and this is representing the contribution. This is a multilinear map. This is kind of like, maybe like the most linear, nonlinear thing you can deal with. So it's nonlinear, so you have a lot of flexibility and expressiveness with it, but you can still understand it without resorting to numerical simulation. But I want to go into this multilinear map stuff because it does attaches to an existing map where these ensemble dynamics, the symbolic pooling, is we can show equivalent to multilinear dynamics up to some normalization technicalities, and we'll eventually show that this is equivalent to replicator mutator, more traditional view. And part of the idea of this multilinearity is that we are often measuring frequencies and how they change over time, and you can be like, oh, there's density-dependent models, or you're maybe instead looking at the actual like total abundance, like actual absolute numbers. And there's many ways to do this, but there's one specific way, this multilinear representation, where when you run the system in you get this geometric growth, but if you kind of like watch the shadow of it on frequency space, then it's going to agree with your frequency-dependent symbolic pooling model, and this is often easier to work with because you don't have to take into account a bunch of normalization. You can't pretty much throw out a bunch of normalization steps and just say, run this geometric growing thing, and then at the end, project down into frequency space. So that's nice, and by construction, we get that these two are equivalent, symbolic pooling and these multilinear dynamics. Now I want to move to the replicator mutator equation. Are people familiar with this? I think most of you are, but for those that don't know, you take the quasi-species equation, you take the replicator equation, and you make them kiss. They're married now with this more general equation, and this one you have some initial state frequencies of different individual types, and then you have a frequency dependent on reproduction. And then, so your fitness is a function of like the frequencies of everybody else. And then there's this mutation step, which is like one step of the Markov chain, and then you get your updated state. Now to make this more similar to our symbolic pooling model, where we're respecting the structure of like, these are the hosts, these are the microbes, these are the bacteriophages, so on. We're going to just classify the individuals into different populations. It's a little hard to see, but there's kind of like these yellow blobs around them. This makes the equations much grosser because you're now like indexing like the populations, and then you're normalizing the populations, but it's the same. It's the same dynamical system underneath. It's just a notational like vomit headache. And now if you make some assumptions about the form of the fitness, namely that it's multilinear. Then you crunch some algebra and you get that multilinear representations are equivalent to the replicator-mutator equations, to the special case of the replicator-mutator equations. And so now you have these are equivalent, these are equivalent. So they're equivalent, and that's nice. We have taken this holobiont problem and we have turned it, translated it into this more traditional, like individual dynamics, replicator-mutator stuff.
I'm sorry, so the mutation here is not true novelty, it's actually is it the shuffling of the horizontal?
Yeah, exactly.
But then but this is deterministic, right? So there's an equal, it's not diffusion because any possible state is available, right?
Mhm.
So you have an equal outflow and inflow to every possible state.
No, like often a lot of these are set to zero depending on like the actual biology, I believe.
Right, it's constrained.
Mhm, yeah, so it's like you could potentially have it flow to everything if you were being, like having really weird biological system, but often you're like, oh, you're most likely to float to kind of something like one mutation away.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm, yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know what soft selection means.
Oh yeah, so this is actually a bit, my committee told me to make this soft selection. This is adapted by my defense, so I listened to what he said, but I would more think of this as just a technical condition that fitness is multilinear. That's the better translation. I forgot to change that for this presentation, but this multilinearity of
Could you
fitness.
define again what multilinear means?
Yeah, so it's linear in one variable if you hold all of the others constant. So it's like a function that takes in a bunch of things, right? Hold a bunch constant except one, and it's linear in that one. So I think like one example is homogeneous multivariate polynomials would be multilinear, I believe. It's a bit weird to wrap your head around, but turns out like symbolically, that update function is multilinear and a bunch of other stuff. And I'm pretty new to the field, so I don't have like a great intuition for multilinearity.
Would local dynamics be multilinear?
Yes,
Yeah,
it-
you got it quadratic.
I think it depends what form of what.
yeah, but there is some replicator equations are multilinear, they're bilinear, I believe, and you can do a transformation from Locke-Volterra to the replicator equations. And Joe knows this better than I do, but
But
you
the
can.
transformation would be nonlinear. The variable.
What did they do?
Yeah, I think so.
It's some weird
I think
variable
so.
substitution,
Yeah.
and you end up going, I think a 4-species replicator equation becomes a 3-species Locke-Volterra equation.
But yeah, because multilinear is also,
Yeah.
you say multilinear because it's using a tensor for the coefficients, right? Like, it's not that the actual dynamics aren't multilinear, because the dynamics are non-linear, right? So there's a distinction there.
No, I think the dynamics are, I want to be careful. The dynamics are multilinear, except that there's some normalization steps that make it non-multilinear. But if you remove these normalization steps, then it's multilinear. And then you can remove these normalization steps in a way that still respects the structure of your original model, so that you can run this unnormalized version and it tells you all the information about the normalized version. Does that?
Do your your dependent variables, is there like a second degree polynomial, third degree polynomial? Is there any kind of like non-linearity? Like
Or, sorry, say that again?
in your equations,
Mhm.
like the variables that you are keeping track, is
Yeah.
there anything that's not linear? Like say x, do you have like any x square, x cubed?
Yes, yes.
So you have that.
A lot of the things end up looking like multivariate homogeneous polynomials.
Okay, I think that's what you are
Yeah, that's what I'm
So
saying.
in the
I
end,
think-
it's like
yeah.
it's not linear in that
Like
sense.
x cubed, but you could have x times y times z.
Yeah. right?
Yeah. But
So that's,
I-
does that make sense?
But like multilinear is, I mean, a tensor is a multilinear map.
Mhm.
That's what you basically just
Yeah.
using it, just tensor dynamics.
Yeah, and part of the reason I want to like talk to people like you is because, like I said, I'm a hack at this, so some of the mathematics is sketchy. I think it's the right tool for the job, but I've struggled a lot trying to learn this because it's a dense field. Okay, we've taken our problem of holobionts and pushed it to this more well-understood individual problem where we make a problem somebody else's. And it was all equivalent. And I was kind of shocked when I discovered this. And what this gives is the same dynamical system. We have multiple perspectives on it. This traditional individual perspective of updating populations of individuals to populations of individuals. And then this kind of dance of recombining into ensembles and then contributing to the next generation of populations, this diagonal thing. And if you kind of shift your perspective a little, you can measure it instead of populations of ensembles updating to ensembles. And okay, we're almost done. I think I'm kind of short on time.
Yeah, we should wrap up by 5, like
Okay.
3 minutes.
In 3 minutes. Okay. So you can classify these into ensembles, so you can, or you classify your ensembles into holobionts, so you just like make some definitions. And the idea here is that you take your ensembles, classify them into holobionts, and now you have 3 perspectives on the same dynamical system where you move from populations of the same type to populations of the same type. Now, you can do something special. You can hit this with your favorite metric of natural selection. I like the price equation because it works on arbitrary systems, but the idea here is that this will tell you the amount of change that is due to natural selection. And you can, because we have this underlying mathematical formalism, we can throw this on each of the perspectives and get a number out, the amount of change due to natural selection. And then some of the perspective, they're fragile, so they'll be low, but you can now compare the holobiont and individual perspectives, and if they're comparable, looking good. If you can find one where it's higher than the individual perspective, congratulations. Now you have holobionts explaining more change due to natural selection than the individual perspective. But on the other hand, no matter how you gerrymander the system, no matter how contrived you classify holobionts, you can't get it up high. Well, the holobionts are probably not a unit of selection in that system. They might be important for explaining other things, but they're not much of a unit of selection. So, to summarize, we've built this mathematical theory to answer this question, and through this translation, we can get a fairly simple way to attack it by this, looking at the same system from different perspectives. And it's a long road to just be able to ask a question, but we've gotten a lot of stuff out of it. We started with this holobiont concept, we got this ensemble concept, we got these perspectives on this system, we got the mathematical formalisms behind it, we have identified tensors and multilinear mass as a potential tool to deal with this, and finally we got our question able to be asked. And at this point you might think, well, maybe the question was a bit unfortunate after all. Maybe the true treasure were the friends we made along the way. Ha ha ha. The question's actually like pretty great. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
So what trait did you use for your price equation? Did you just use your actual fitness, like some Fisher's law, or like the Z usually? You have to measure some difference in trait value, right? What did you choose here to measure the differentials?
Yeah, I didn't really choose anything because this is this is a very hot off the press, late in the game like thing where it's like, well, I know price equation works on arbitrary systems, so in theory you could just slap that on your system and get a number out, but I didn't make any choices of like specific traits. But I guess the trait would be like which individual you are, like, or what
because I guess, yeah, this is a question, because in my experience, the Z requires some quantitative trait values continue. Well, I guess it's not clear to me, because you're using categorical traits, like discrete categorical traits. So it's unclear to me how, so there is no natural metric or distance in the state space, the trait space. So then having a distance of a trait value, because it's delta Z, right? It's not clear to me how one would do that unless you're mapping some quantitative, some continuous value, or associating a continuous value to combinatoric, right?
Yeah,
Combination.
that makes sense. And I guess I have two answers to that question. One is that a person who did price equation stuff told me it can't be done, so I'm like, okay. And two, the price equation was almost kind of an arbitrary one that I chose to select on these. I'm really thinking that you choose your favorite metric, change due to natural selection, and then throw it on. So I can't really answer that. Maybe the price equation is the wrong thing to attack.
No, I'm not doubting you. I'm just trying to understand how you just use it. And you can use, I mean, like Fisher's law, for example, you can derive from the price equation just by choosing fitness as the trait, right? So it's a very versatile.
And I think it can be done, but I don't know how.
At the end, it's just a statistical relation.
Because I guess what I'm saying, and then I haven't thought about it much. I'm like, I think you can do this, sure. Throw it on. Price equation is powerful. But yeah, you bring up good points, like maybe you have to be careful and subtle with how you do it.
Thank you.
Nice. Okay, yeah, thanks. That was awesome. Thank you. All right, we have a really quick turnaround. We're going off island, so we gotta get to the lighthouse by like 5:20. Yeah, so if you want